Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel where we bring the most iconic action stories to life. Today we are diving into a true Filipino classic on Panday, lit. The Blacksmith is a 1980 Filipino action fantasy film produced and directed by Fernando Poe Jr., who also stars as the titular character. It is based on the fictional comics character of the same name, created by Carlo J. Caparas and illustrated by Steve Gunn. The film was followed by 3 sequels, which also feature in Poe as Flavio, namely Pagbabalik in Panday, 1981, On Panday, Ikalawang Yugto, 1982, and On Panday 4, Ikea Pat na Aklat, 1984. All 4 films were shown at the Metro Manila Film Festival in their respective years. An animated TV series, dubbed as the first full-length Filipino animation series, was shown in APN 9 during the mid-1980s. It was patterned after the storyline of the first movie. Flavio, Fernando Poe, Jr., is a Panday, or blacksmith, whose village and land are under the reign of the tyrant Lizardo, Max Alvarado. Flavio is forced to brand innocent children every night with Lizardo's mark by the head of Lizardo's men in the village, Pilo, Paquito Diaz. One day, Flavio's predecessor as Panday, Tata Temyam, Lito Anzures, finds the legendary Black Book that supposedly tells how Lizardo can be defeated. Later that night a meteorite lands in a nearby field. Based on a prophecy in the Black Book, Flavio and Tata Temyam then use the meteorite and an old bell to create a magic dagger, the only weapon that can defeat Lizardo. After finishing the weapon, Flavio hunts down Lizardo's men in the village. He brands them before setting off with Tata Temyam, his young apprentice Lando, Bentot Jr., and Monica, Liza Lindigan, a woman he had saved from Lizardo's men, to free the land. On their way to Lizardo, they come across a seaside hut that is home to one of Lizardo's henchmen, a wizard. Flavio defeats him, but soon afterward they are attacked by Sayakoi, mermen, that are driven away when Flavio's dagger hums, and when Pilo arrives seeking revenge against Flavio, they attack him and his men instead. Later Flavio and his companions are attacked by zombies in a forest. Tata Temyam and Monica end up captured and brought to Lizardo's fortress by his men. Elsewhere Lando finds refuge in a hut haunted by an aswang, and after a chase, Flavio finds and defeats it with his dagger. Lizardo later challenges Flavio to a duel, and brings Tata Temyam, Monica, and all his slaves to witness the battle. He first orders his men to attack Flavio, who, though vastly outnumbered, defeats them after his dagger transforms into a sword. Lizardo then faces Flavio himself, only to rapidly age every time Flavio hits him. Flavio ends the duel by stabbing Lizardo in the chest, who dies and fades away. With Lizardo defeated, Flavio leads his companions and the former slaves to freedom. In the Journal of Film and Video, Leonard Soberson stated that the action film genre has been a subject of scholarly debate since the 1980s. For Soberson wrote that repeated traits of the genre include chase sequences, fights, shootouts, explosions, and stunt work, while other scholars asserted there were more underlying traits that define the genre. For David Bordwell in The Way Hollywood Tells It wrote that audiences are told that spectacle overrides narrative in action cinema, while Wheeler Winston Dixon echoed that these films were typified by excessive spectacle as a desperate attempt to mask the lack of content. 5. Jeff King argued that the spectacle can also be a vehicle for narrative, opposed to interfering with it. 6. Soberson stated that Harvey O'Brien had perhaps the most convincing understanding of the genre, stating that the action film was best understood as a fusion of form and content. It represents the idea and ethic of action through a form in which action agitation, and movement are paramount. 4. O'Brien wrote further in his book Action Movies, the cinema of striking back to suggest action films being unique and not just a series of action sequences, stating that that was the difference between Raiders of the Lost Ark, 1981, and Die Hard, 1988, that while both were mainstream Hollywood blockbusters with the hero asserting masculinity and overcoming obstacles to a personal and social solution, John McClane in Die Hard repeatedly firing his automatic pistol while swinging from a high rise was not congruent with the image of Indiana Jones in Raiders swinging his whip to fend off villains in the backstreets of Cairo. 7. British author and academic Yvonne Tasker expanded on this topic, stating that action films have no clear and constant iconography or settings. In her book The Hollywood Action and Adventure Film, 2015, she found that the most broadly consistent themes tend to be a character's quest from freedom from oppression, such as a hero overcoming enemies or obstacles and physical conflicts or challenge, usually battling other humans or alien opponents. 8. By late 2010 studies of genre analysis, the term genre itself is often replaced or supplemented with the words mode and narrative form, with all three terms often being used interchangeably. 9. Johan Hoagland and Agnieszka Soltysik-Monas said that the difference between these concepts are elusive, but stated that genre could be defined as belonging to specific historical and cultural moments, while mode and form can refer to a larger pattern that operates across a wider historical and cultural field. 9. In their book Action Cinema Since 2000, 2024, Tasker, Lisa Peirce, and Chris Homeland stated that thinking of action as a mode is more helpful than thinking of it as a genre. 10. The three authors suggested that action frames a certain manner of filmmaking and viewing exceed genre without eclipsing it, stating that websites such as IMDb and Wikipedia rarely label films by a single genre, and that streaming services such as Amazon Prime and Netflix similarly dilutes what is marketed and received as action. 10. In transnational cinema, there are two major trends in action films: Hollywood action films and their style being imitated around the globe, and the other being Chinese-language martial arts films. 11. The roots of action films extend into the beginning of film, but it was only in the mid-20th century when action films developed into their own recognizable genre instead of being a collection of other types of films such as westerns, swashbucklers, or adventure films. 1. Films have been described action films, or action-adventure film, as early as the 1910s. 4. 12. Only by the 1980s was the term action as its own unique genre used routinely in terms of promotion and reviewing practices. 1. Hong Kong action films. Main article: Hong Kong action cinema. The first Chinese-language martial arts films can be traced to Shanghai cinema of the late 1920s. These films were popular during the period, which comprised almost 60% of the total Chinese films. Manfeng Yip stated that these films were rather tame by contemporary standards. 13. He wrote that they lacked the kind of dazzling action choreography as expected today and had crude and rudimentary special effects. 13. These films came under increasing attack by both government officials and cultural elites for their allegedly superstitious and anarchistic tendencies, leading them to be banned in 1932. It was not until the base of Chinese commercial filmmaking was relocated from Shanghai to Hong Kong in the late 1940s that martial arts cinema was revived. These films contained much of the characteristics of the previous era. During this period, over 100 films were based on the adventures of real-life Cantonese folk hero Wang Feiheng, who first appeared in film in 1949. These films primarily circuited within Hong Kong and Cantonese-speaking areas with Chinese diaspora. 14, Yip continued that these Hong Kong films were still lagging behind in aesthetic and technical standards that films from the United States, Europe, and Japan had during this period. 15. Yip described Japanese cinema as the most advanced in Asia at the time. This was showcased by the international breakthrough of Akira Kurosawa's films like Rashomon, 1950, 15. The film genre known as the chambro was at its height in Japan. The style was a subgenre to the jidegeki, or period drama with an emphasis on sword fighting and action. 16. It had a similar level of popularity to that of the Western in the United States. The most internationally known films of this era were the films Kurosawa with Seven Samurai, 1954, The Hidden Fortress, 1958, and Yojimbo, 1961. 17. By at least the 1950s, Japanese films were looked upon as a model to be emulated by Hong Kong film production, and Hong Kong film companies began actively enlisting professionals from Japan, such as cinematographer Tadashi Nishimoto, to contribute to color and widescreen cinematography. 15. New literary sources also developed in martial arts. Films of this period, with the Shinpai Wuxia Xiaoshua, or New School martial arts fiction, coming into prominence with the success of Huyan Yushin's Longhu Do Jinhua, 1954, and Jin Yan Shujian and Chulu, 1956, which showed influence of the Shanghai martial arts films but also circulated from Hong Kong to Taiwan and Chinese communities overseas. This led to a growing demand in both local and regional markets in the early 1960s and saw a surge in production of Hong Kong martial arts films that went beyond the stories about Wong Fei Hung, which were declining in popularity. 18. These new martial arts films feature magical swordplay and higher production values and more sophisticated special effects than the previous films with Shaw Brothers, a campaign of New School Shinpai martial arts swordplay films such as Susan Holmes' Temple of the Red Lotus, 1965, and King Who's Come Drink With Me, 1966. 19. The popularity of Bruce Lee attracted a global audience for kung fu films. However, his career was cut short following his untimely death in 1973, which led to a decline in popularity for the art form. 20. In the 1970s, the Hong Kong martial arts films began to grow under the format of Yongen, staunch masculinity, mostly through the films of Chan Che, which were popular. This transition led to the kung fu film subgenre at beginning of the decade and moved beyond the swordplay films with contemporary settings of late Qing or early Republican periods and had more hand-to-hand combat over supernatural swordplay and special effects. 21. A new studio, Golden Harvest, quickly became one of independent filmmakers to grant creative freedom and pay, and attracted new directors and actors, including Bruce Lee. 22. The popularity of kung fu films and Bruce Lee led to attract a global audience of these films in the United States and Europe, but was cut short on Lee's death in 1973, leading the phase's popularity to decline. 20. Following a period of stagnation, Chan Che and Lau Kar-leung revitalized the genre with Shaolin Kung Fu films and Chor Yuan series of darker swordplay films based on the novels of Gu Lam. 20. Kung fu comedies appeared featuring Jackie Chan as martial arts films flourished into the 1980s. Other films again modernized the form with gangster films of John Woo, A Better Tomorrow, 1986, The Killer, 1989, and the Wong Fei Hung saga returning in Sui Hark's Once Upon a Time in China featuring Jet Li, which again revitalized the swordplay style films. 20. By the turn of the century, Hollywood action films would look towards Hong Kong cinema and bringing some of their major actors and directors over to apply their style to their films, such as Chan, Woo, Lee, Michelle Yeoh, and Yuan Wu. King. 23. The release of Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, 2000, led to a global release status of Chinese-language martial arts films, most notably Zhang Yimou's Hero, 2002, and House of Flying Daggers, 2004, Stephen Chow's Kung Fu Hustle, 2004, and Shin Kaiga's The Promise, 2005, 24. Most Hong Kong action films in the first quarter of the 21st century, such as those in Cold War, 2012, Cold War II, 2016, and the White Storm film series have their violence toned down, especially compared to the earlier work of directors like Wu and Johnny 25, Anton Chen, in his study on the Hong Kong action film, wrote that the influence of China and the amount of Chinese co-productions made with Hong Kong created a shift in these films, particularly following the release of Infernal Affairs, 2002. 26. Hollywood action films. Harvey O'Brien wrote in 2012 that the contemporary action film emerged through other genres, primarily westerns, crime and war films, and can be separated into four forms: the formative, the classical, the post-classical and neoclassical phases. 27. Yvonne Tasker reiterated this in her book on action and adventure films, saying that action films became a distinct genre during the new Hollywood period of the 1970s. 8. Steve McQueen in 1968, the year Bullitt was released. The formative films would be from the 1960s to the early 1980s, where the anti-hero appears in cinema, featuring characters who act and transcend the law and social conventions. This appears initially in films like Bullitt, 1968, where a tough police officer protects society by upholding the law against systematic corruption. This extended into films which O'Brien described as knee-jerk responses to perceived threats, with rogue cop and vigilante films such as Dirty Harry, 1971, and Death Wish, 1974, where the restoration of order is only possible by force and antisocial characters prepared to act when society does not. 27. The vigilantism reappears in other films that were exploitative of Southern society, such as Billy Jack, 1971, and White Lightning, 1973, and Good Old Boy comedies like Smokey and the Bandit, 1977. This era also emphasizes the car chase scenes as moments of spectacle in films like Bullitt and The French Connection, 1971. O'Brien described these films as emphasizing the fusion of man and machine, with the drivers and vehicles acting as one, concluding with what he described as the ultimate in apocalyptic modernity and social erasure in Mad Max 2, 1981. 28. O'Brien described the classical form of action cinema to be the 1980s. The decade continued the trends of formative period with heroes as Avengers, Lethal Weapon, 1987, Rogue Police Officers, Die Hard, 1988, and Mercenary Warriors, Commando, 1985. Following the continuity of the car and man hybrid of the previous decade, the 1980s featured weaponized men who were either also carrying weapons such as Sudden Impact, 1983, Trained to be Weapons, American Ninja, 1985, or imbued with technology, RoboCop, 1987. 28. O'Brien noted that the formative trends at this point had become identifiably generic as film industries began to reproduce these films during the decade. Producers like Joel Silver and production companies like the Canon Group Incorporated began to formulate production of these films with both high and low budgets. 29. The action films of this era have roots in classical storytelling, specifically rooted from martial arts films and westerns, and are built around a three-act structure centered on survival, resistance, and revenge, with narratives where the physical body of the hero is tested, traumatized, and ultimately triumphant. 30. The third shift in action cinema, the post-classical, was defined by the predominance of Eastern cinema and its aesthetics, primarily the wirework of Hong Kong action cinema from the classical era, through the convention of the increasingly computer-generated effects. This saw the decline of overt masculinity in the action film, which corresponded with the end of the Cold War in 1991, while the rise of self-referential and parodies of this era grew in films like Last Action Hero, 1993. O'Brien described this era as being soft, where the hard bodies of the classical era were replaced with computer-generated imagery such as that of Terminator 2, Judgment Day, 1991, Doc. 31. This was displayed in corresponded with millennial angst and apocalypticism showcased in films like Independence Day, 1996, and Armageddon, 1998. 32. Action films of mass destruction began requiring more overtly superheroic characters, with further comic book adaptations being made with increased non-realistic settings with films like The Matrix, 1999. 33. The fourth phase arrived following the September 11 attacks in 2001, which suggested an end to fantastical elements that defined the action hero and genre. 33. Following the release of Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill, Volume 1, 2003, and Kill Bill, Volume 2, 2004. Revisited the tropes of 1970s action films, leading a renaissance of vengeance narratives in films like The Brave One, 2007, and Taken, 2008. O'Brien found that Tarantino's films were postmodern takes on the themes that rescinded irony to restore cinephile reactualization of the genre's conventions. 33. The genre went into full circle, resurrecting films from the classical period with Live Free or Die Hard, 2007, and Rambo, 2008, finding the characters navigating a contemporary world while also acknowledging their age, culminating into The Expendables, 2010, film. 33. The most commercially successful action films and franchise of the 21st century have been comic book adaptations, which commenced with the X-Men and is seen in other series such as Spider-Man and Iron Man series. 34. 35. Tasker wrote that despite the central characters in superhero cinema being extraordinary, occasionally even godlike, they often followed the traces of the central character becoming powerful, of which is fundamental to action films, often dealt with origin stories in superhero films. Several subcategories of fantasy films can be identified, although the delineations between these subgenres, much as in fantasy literature, are somewhat fluid. The most common fantasy subgenres depicted in movies are high fantasy and sword and sorcery, according to whom? Both categories typically employ quasi-medieval settings, wizards, magical creatures, and other elements commonly associated with fantasy stories. High fantasy films tend to feature a more richly developed fantasy world, and may also be more character-oriented or thematically complex. Often, they feature a hero of humble origins and a clear distinction between good and evil set against each other in an epic struggle. Many scholars cite J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings novel as the prototypical modern example of high fantasy in literature, and the recent Peter Jackson film adaptation of the books is a good example of the high fantasy subgenre on the silver screen. Sword and sorcery movies tend to be more plot-driven than high fantasy and focus heavily on action sequences, often pitting a physically powerful but unsophisticated warrior against an evil wizard or other supernaturally endowed enemy. Although sword and sorcery films sometimes describe an epic battle between good and evil similar to those found in many high fantasy movies, they may alternately present the hero as having more immediate motivations, such as the need to protect a vulnerable maiden or village, or even being driven by the desire for vengeance. The 1982 film adaptation of Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, for example, is a personal, non-epic story concerning the hero's quest for revenge and his efforts to thwart a single megalomaniac, while saving a beautiful princess in the process. Some critics refer to such films by the term sword and sandal rather than sword and sorcery, although others would maintain that the sword and sandal label should be reserved only for the subset of fantasy films set in ancient history on the planet Earth, and still others would broaden the term to encompass films that have no fantastic elements whatsoever. To some, the term sword and sandal has pejorative connotations, designating a film with a low-quality script, bad acting, and poor production values. Following the success of these ventures, Hollywood studios have greenlighted additional big-budget productions in the genre. These have included adaptations of the first, second, and third books in C.S. Lewis' The Chronicles of Narnia and the teen novel Aragon, as well as adaptations of Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising, Cornelia Funk's Inkheart, Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass, Holly Black's The Spiderwick Chronicles, Nickelodeon's TV show Avatar, The Last Airbender, and the Fantasia segment, along with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's original poem, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Many fantasy movies starting in the 2000s, such as the Lord of the Rings films, the first and third Narnia adaptations, and the first, second, fourth, and seventh Harry Potter adaptations have most often been released in November and December. This is in contrast to sci-fi films, which are often released during the Northern Hemisphere summer, June, August. All three of the Pirates of the Caribbean films, however, were released in July 2003, July 2006, and May 2007 respectively, and the latest releases in the Harry Potter series were released in July 2007 and July 2009. The huge commercial success of these pictures may indicate a change in Hollywood's approach to big-budget fantasy film releases. Screenwriter and scholar Eric A. Williams identifies fantasy films as one of 11 supergenres in his screenwriter's taxonomy, claiming that all feature-length narrative films can be classified by these supergenres. The other 10 supergenres are action, crime, horror, romance, sci-fi, slice of life, sports, thriller, war, and western. 3. Fantasy films have a history almost as old as the medium itself. However, fantasy films were relatively few and far between until the 1980s, when high-tech filmmaking techniques and increased audience interest caused the genre to flourish. What follows are some notable fantasy films. For a more complete list, see List of fantasy films. 1900, 1920s. See also List of fantasy films before 1930. In the era of silent film, the earliest fantasy films were those made by French film pioneer Georges Méliès from 1903. The most famous of these was 1902's A Trip to the Moon. In the golden age of silent film, 1918 to 1926, the most outstanding fantasy films were Douglas Fairbanks' The Thief of Baghdad, 1924, Fritz Lang's Die Nibelungen, 1924, and Destiny, 1921. Other notables in the genre were F. W. Murnau's romantic ghost story Phantom, Tarzan of the Apes starring Elmo Lincoln, and D. W. Griffith's The Sorrows of Sagan. Following the advent of sound films, audiences of all ages were introduced from 1937's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to 1939's The Wizard of Oz. Also notable of the era, the iconic 1933 film King Kong borrows heavily from the Lost World subgenre of fantasy fiction, as does such films as the 1935 adaptation of H. Rider Haggard's novel She, about an African expedition that discovers an immortal queen known as Aisha, she who must be obeyed. Frank Capra's 1937 picture Lost Horizon transported audiences to the Himalayan fantasy kingdom of Shangri-La, where the residents magically never age. Other noteworthy fantasy films of the 30s include Tarzan the Ape Man in 1932 starring Johnny Weissmuller, starting a successful series of talking pictures based on the fantasy adventure novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and the G.W. Pabst directed The Mistress of Atlantis from 1932. 1932 saw the release of the Universal Studios monster movie The Mummy, which combined horror with a romantic fantasy twist. More light-hearted and comedic affairs from the decade include films like 1934's romantic drama film Death Takes a Holiday, where Frederick March plays Death, who takes a human body to experience life for 3 days, and 1937's Topper, where a man is haunted by two fun-loving ghosts who try to make his life a little more exciting. 1940s. See also, List of fantasy films of the 1940s. The 1940s then saw several full-color fantasy films produced by Alexander Korda, including The Thief of Baghdad, 1940, a film on par with The Wizard of Oz, and Jungle Book, 1942. In 1946, Jean Cocteau's classic adaptation of Beauty and the Beast won praise for its surreal elements and for transcending the boundaries of the fairy tale genre. Sinbad the Sailor, 1947, starring Douglas Fairbanks Jr., has the feel of a fantasy film, though it does not actually have any fantastic elements. Several other pictures featuring supernatural encounters and aspects of Bayesian fantasy were produced in the 1940s during World War II. These include Beyond Tomorrow, The Devil and Daniel Webster, and Here Comes Mr. Jordan, all from 1941, Heaven Can Wait, the musical Cabin in the Sky, 1943, the comedy The Horn Blows at Midnight, and romances such as The Ghost and Mrs. Near, 1947, One Touch of Venus and Portrait of Jenny, both 1948. An astonishing anticipation of the full sword and sorcery genre was made in 1941 in Italy by Alessandro Bossetti. La Corona di Ferro presents the struggles of two imaginary kingdoms around the legendary Iron Crown, historically the ancient crown of Italy, with war, cruelty, betrayal, heroism, sex, magic, and mysticism, a whirl of events taken from every possible fairy tale and legend source Bossetti could find. This movie is unlike anything done before, indeed, considering that it was finished 15 years before the publication of Lord of the Rings. Its invention of a vast, national epic mythology is an act of genius. And while the storytelling is rough, due to the need to insert everything, and the resources limited, Bossetti shows how to make a little go a long way through beautifully staged and designed battle and crowd scenes. Although it's not classified as a fantasy film, Gene Kelly's Anchors Away had a fantasy sequence called The King Who Couldn't Dance, in which Jane did a song and dance number with Jerry Mouse from Tom and Jerry. Because these movies do not feature elements common to high fantasy or sword and sorcery pictures, some modern critics do not consider them to be examples of the fantasy genre.